Hello, my name is Ken Hughes. I'm a consumer and shopper behaviourist and customer experience strategist fascinated by the science, psychology and sociology of why people buy, how they buy, and ultimately how we can make them buy more if we're being evil. I have some great questions here from the London Speaker Bureau, my friends there in the agency, and I'm going to answer them for you now. I mean, for me as a behaviourist, the pandemic was a fascinating space, watching social and economic change all over the world ripple at the same time. Everybody, no matter the demographic or the geography, was affected by this at the same time. The captive economy was about looking at how people behave under incarceration, slavery, kidnapping, when people are captive, how they react. And so I looked at the psychology of captivity and applied that obviously to the businesses and brands that I work with all over the world. Some really simple values. I mean, to do with autonomy and freedom, we take freedom for granted, but when you take that away, people have a yearning for control, and that is actually still very true today. People have a yearning for control with the brands and businesses that they deal with. Attachment, people are really yearning for attachment, to belong, and through that open heart that we find our consumer with now is our access point to customer lifetime value. There's this heartbeat value around community, and obviously during the pandemic that was really strong, community, wanting to belong. Post-pandemic less so, and obviously it's about how you capitalize on that feeling of belonging now with brands that have a solid why. Why does your business exist? How can I align your business values with my values as a consumer? How those things fit together? And so all that kind of stuff is really important post-pandemic, because the values that people learned during the pandemic are now values that they live their lives by, hopes, dreams, and obviously the products and services that they buy. So the blue dot consumer, the blue dot metaphor comes from, actually I think I have one here. Do you remember these? These were called maps. This is a map of London. And so in the old way, we used to use these to move around the world. And this was old technology. And to use this, of course, you had to have a start point and an end point. You have to know where you are and where you're going. And if you have those two pieces of information, then you can use this technology. You grew up in a world where you understood you were a small part of a big, big world. And you have to learn to navigate your way through the world. Now that was the old way, because today we have the blue dot, that little blue dot on the Google Maps phone, and it follows you. You are at the center, and that's the difference. You're at the center of the world. You are the world. Every brand, every business needs to revolve around you, and that's what the blue dot consumer is about. Understanding that the business models now have to put the consumer at the center. So Uber is a blue dot product that brings the car to you. Deliveroo is a blue dot product that brings the meal to you. And so this idea of, and obviously the pandemic accelerated blue dot behavior hugely, where I stay where I am, and the brands, the businesses, the customer experience, the employee experience, everything revolves around me. I'm at the center. I'm not the end point of a customer journey. I am the center of the journey. And that really, when I talk to all my clients about customer centricity and what customer experience actually means as a philosophy, that's what it's about. It's about the blue dot. It's about actually, I want it my way, I want it personalized, I want it instant. You wouldn't follow someone else's blue dot on a map, would you? So I want everything around me, built around me, my needs. I want it now, I want it instant, I want it updated. And so it's got a huge amount of modern consumer values underneath that metaphor. That is what the blue dot consumer means. I think it's probably around connection. I think the yearning for connection coming out of the pandemic was really obvious from a physical point of view. We want to physically reconnect with our friends, with our families, socially. But also now connectivity becomes something really interesting. So leadership is all about vulnerability, leading with authenticity post-pandemic. And consumer behavior is all around connecting with consumers in a way that gives us customer lifetime value. So we talk about brand loyalty, customer lifetime value all the time. What do those things actually mean? We use really aggressive language: customer acquisition, customer retention. Like if that was a Tinder profile, what you're saying is here, does this hanky smell like chloroform and get into the cage in my basement? That's customer acquisition and retention. So we need to understand that we actually have to connect with our consumers in real ways to form a relationship, a long-term relationship. That's what gives us customer lifetime value. So I think post-pandemic, our framework is moving away from the transactional, very much towards the relationship. How can we have a long relationship with customers? That's evident, by the way, in B2B as well as B2C. And so the focus now is, why should consumers buy from us? What are our mission? What's our why? And beyond profit, beyond the corporate entity, why do we exist? And how can we really link those things strongly to a consumer so they have emotive brand loyalty as opposed to transactional brand loyalty? So to me, it's all about connection, emotive connection, connection that matters, connection with compassion. So compassionate commerce over just kind of corporate noise. So what's really fascinating about the pandemic and working from home and is that when we have routines that we fall into like a little rut, we tend to get less creative. Creativity comes from the new, comes from the new idea. So creativity is having a new idea. Innovation is the application of that new idea to a product, a service, or a process. Now, without having the new ideas, we obviously can't be innovative. So the innovation sludge I'm talking about is kind of us getting stuck in the mud, unable to move forward because we're not getting new stimulus into the top of the funnel. So I often talk about, make sure in your work that you're exposed to new people, new ways of thinking, new places, new languages, new foods, even outside of your work life, your personal life. As long as you put lots of new stuff in the top of the funnel, you'll end up having new ideas because that's the way you train the brain. The brain's kind of like a muscle, and it's kind of like, the more new stimulus you put in there, the chances are you might have an output that is obviously a new way of looking at something. And so the innovation sludge is what I'm worried about, is that really the whole working from home thing has lost people's flow. They're just doing the basics. They're moving very slowly, and that's where we're seeing that impact now 2 years later, in that the innovation speed, the sprint speed that we need in agile companies maybe isn't there. It is there in some companies, but ultimately a lot of CX and C-level leaders that I'm talking about all over the world are seeing that their people, this is the great resignation, people aren't really where they should be in terms of innovation. And that's an issue. And it's an issue that I talk about with my clients in keynotes a lot, in terms of how to actually overcome that issue and how to train at a personal level people's creative and innovative spark back. Yeah, it's one of my most booked speeches, The Big Take Back. The Big Take Back looks at the psychology of recovery and survival. So while the trauma is interesting, which is the pandemic, obviously coming out of the pandemic, the recovery is the more interesting part. And actually, it's the hardest part. So if you think of something as simple as, remember the Fritzl case where he kept his daughter in a basement for like 13 years or something. So that surviving that ordeal is horrendous. But actually recovering from the ordeal and building a normal life, that's the harder part than the survival. So we're just coming out of the 2-year pandemic now, and that was the hard part, you would think. But actually, sometimes it's the easy part. You're running on adrenaline. We did what needed to be done. Now, from brands and businesses, we're entering, and particularly from a leadership point of view, we're entering into the hardest part, the recovery. To have a successful recovery, you need connection, hope, identity, meaning, and purpose, and empowerment. It's called a CHIME model. So that Big Take Back speech looks at the psychology of recovery, the psychology of survival. What are the 10 attributes that people need for absolute survival? What are the 5 attributes that need a successful recovery? And we apply each of those to brands and businesses, giving teams actually literally kind of scorecard and tick boxes to say, okay, here's how we're going to have a recovery, here's how we're going to leapfrog our competitors, and here's how we're going to go beyond where we thought we would post-pandemic. And really it's a strategy. So the Big Take Back is all about energizing the workforce, energizing CX teams, and energizing business and brands around the recovery phase, not going back to normal. I use a phrase called the never normal, because the new normal, it's a bit jaded. The never normal is where we're in now. We have to have agile companies that are always ready to pivot, always ready for the new. We're heading into a really disruptive decade. And so the only way to do that is to make sure that your teams are ready and energized. And that's what the Big Take Back is all about.